Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and this evening we're going to be talking about inequality in income and wealth. And to help us understand it, we have with us this evening Christian Weller, Professor of Public Policy from UMASS Boston. Got all that out. Good.
Thank you very much for having me, George.
Yeah, your business card must be a 3x5, you know.
We don't do business cards these days.
Okay. So, now with all the flap about Roe v. Wade, income and wealth inequality seems to have gone back on the back burner, and not talking about it too much, but it'll pop up again. And I guess the thing I need to understand before we get too deep into it is everybody's different. You're born into a system, and some people can adapt to it very well, some don't, some mediocre. And if I look around, I can see this. I'm doing better than some people, and I see there's a lot of people doing better than me. And so there's going to always be an inequality.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what's a reasonable goal to accept is how much inequality is acceptable and how much is a problem that's got to be fixed.
You started off with the toughest question for us to answer.
Yeah.
That is, where should we end up? And everybody will give you different answers, depending a little bit on their philosophical anchoring. Some people will say, like, okay, well, we have to have perfect inequality, meaning everybody has the same resources at the end of a certain period, say like retirement. Yeah. That's not where I think most people will fall. These days, I think sort of a consensus, I wouldn't say consensus, but sort of something where a lot of Americans feel comfortable with is we need equality of opportunity. Opportunity in the United States means more so than in many other countries having wealth on your own,
yeah.
Meaning family wealth. When you're,
yeah.
Because it requires, like, wealth determines, for instance, which neighborhoods you can move to. Like if the neighborhood that you live in does not have the schools that you think are appropriate for your kids, you want to move to. But a move costs several $1,000s. That means you need to have wealth to do that. We can go through that. It's the schooling, it's childcare, it's the jobs you're getting, the internships you're getting. A lot of the stuff depends on wealth. Now, we can say, like, we leave inequality as it is, but we then create public policy programs to address those inequalities, to make sure that there is a leveling up, that everybody has the same opportunities. Whether people take advantage of those opportunities is a different story.
Yeah.
But we're only slowly getting to this, where we're saying, okay, well, for instance, we need make sure that college is affordable for everybody, that people do not end college with debt, or that we have universal child care programs so that people who want to work can work and do not have to choose between caring for a child and working and having an uninterrupted career. Those are policy measures that in the end are going towards equality of opportunity. The other part to the question is also, why are we ending up in this massive inequality system? Right now, for instance, 70% of all wealth is owned by the top 10% of wealth holders. Yeah. That's a massive concentration we haven't seen since the 1920s. How do we get there? Well, there is a lot of stories here, but it in the end boils down to policy has a lot to do with it. There's different ways of by which we reward wealth. Some would say unjustly. But that allows for this massive concentration of wealth. And if it's policy driven to a very large degree, not just talents, not just abilities, but also that people can extract wealth, can build wealth with the help of government policies, then we can also reverse a lot of the stuff. And my favorite is tax policy. One of the things I study as an economist, as an expert, is retirement income security. We're spending about $150 to $200 billion a single year to help people save for retirement. For every $100 that the federal government forgoes in tax revenue, to get people to save more for retirement, people will say $1 extra. I can't think of any policy that's less efficient than that.
Well, what kind of thing?
Well, like
How is this working? Because I don't remember.
you have a pension. I happen to know.
Yeah.
So when your employer provided money into your pension, for instance, and pensions are sort of still somewhat equalizing depending on which workplace you're looking at. But the money that your employer put into your pension is actually income to you, but you didn't pay income taxes to it. So that's one way.
So that's where the government is foregoing collecting.
Yeah, right.
They're not donating anything to
well,
my
it's
pension.
the same. Like from a tax perspective, it's the same money. It's the same thing. Whether you're not collecting the income taxes you should be getting, or you're giving people money directly into the account.
Well, they got into the whole business about during World War II when they froze the wages, and the only way you could entice people to come work for you was some sort of benefits, which is where the
pensions are sort of a weird thing, because we very few people, less than 20% of the private sector, have a pension these days. They used to be more than 50%.
It's 401ks now.
Nowadays, 401ks are highly unequal because you can contribute $18,500 a year, but as a maximum.
Yeah.
But you need to make $18,500 to begin with.
Well, you need a spare $18,500
in order, and then once you put it in, then the government also does not tax as any capital gains you have until you retire. So there's a bunch of things that go in there. Basically, 401ks and IRAs, individual retirement accounts, become sort of tax shelters for really wealthy people, and we see this in the data. It's an inefficient policy. It doesn't work. It doesn't increase savings, but it builds wealth at the top. So we can change things. There's other things we can do. The bottom line is we have massive inequality. That we build this inequality based on public policy, often tax policy, because that's the way we do social policy in the United States, which means the government is losing resources that it could then use otherwise to, for instance, make college more affordable, put more childcare, basically build a care infrastructure. These days is not just about childcare, it's also making sure that people who care for their parents and grandparents or for other adults with disabilities have the support that they need in order that they don't have to choose between working and caring for somebody else. Those things, right? Like the government can spend its money only once. And if it decides to incentivize really rich people to save even more in a tax shelter, then that money is not available for childcare. And it's as simple as that. So I think we can do that. The bigger question, though, that I thought you would start with is inequality bad? And the flip side of your answer, where should we go in terms of what's the optimal level of inequality, is at this point, we are so far away from anything that economists would think is optimal that essentially most people would say, like, let's start shrinking inequality as it is. And then we'll sort of...
How would you define an optimum inequality?
Well, so again, optimum, we don't know exactly what the optimum is because it depends a little bit on your philosophical anchoring.
Everybody's perspective is...
But we do know that what we have now is unhealthy and is unstable and unsustainable. It has to do with the fact that huge groups of the population have too few resources to take advantage of all the opportunities that they could. This is true for people of color, in particular African Americans and Latinos. This is true for single women. And this is true for a large share of the Asian American population. This is also true for a lot of white people in rural areas. So we're talking, other than white people in rural areas, the other groups are growing population groups. That doesn't mean we should ignore white people in rural areas, or we should leave people in general in rural areas behind, not just white people. We're sort of creating, like, the people who can take advantage of the opportunities, of the educational opportunities. Think about Massachusetts. We have enormous educational healthcare opportunities. But just in Massachusetts, right, these things are concentrated in the greater Boston area, and even in Boston, concentrated in either the city or in a few suburbs.
Yeah.
Like, there's many suburbs around even Beverly that are not as well served as we are. So we're talking, this is like, we live in a neighborhood, we live in an area where we have all the opportunities. And then there's lots of our neighbors in neighboring cities and towns that do not.
Yeah.
It's more about how do we create these opportunities. If we do not, we're leaving a growing share of the population ever further behind. That's bad for the economy because we're not getting the talent that we want. We don't get the sort of the phrase in economics these days is lost Einsteins. We're not giving children who could be the next Einstein, who could help us solve the pressing problems of climate change and other pressing problems. We're not giving them the educational opportunities to advance and bring their talents to the world because we're leaving them behind, because they don't have the resources, the family resources that they need to succeed.
Well, what you was saying early on about having the wealth and the resources to move to an area,
Right.
that implies that, among other things, and one of the problems that I'm very sensitive to is when the Rust Belt started to really go bad, businesses disappeared and they left the town with nothing. And all of a sudden, you may have owned a house, but its value depreciated significantly. And in a worst case, you're looking at something like Detroit,
Right.
where the auto industry moved out because of lots of reasons. And I always like that comparison. They show a picture of Hiroshima a couple of years ago and Detroit, and they said, again, who won the war?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. But this is happening all over the country. So,
Well, you don't have to go to Michigan,
No.
right? You just need to drive out Route 2 in Massachusetts.
you just go to Lynn.
You go.
GE is closing down slowly down there.
And you point exactly the finger at this. Like the answer is like, why are people from Lynn or from Western Mass not moving? Well, because their wealth was stored in their house, and their house all of a sudden that used to be maybe $50,000, $100,000 worth can sell maybe for $5,000, and their move will cost them $10,000, and that doesn't even mean have any money to buy something new. So that's one issue. The massive inequality, wealth inequality, perpetuates itself in terms of lack of opportunity in the economy, slows economic growth. The second part is, which is sort of like, we are a consumer-driven economy. Rich people can't buy that many yachts and that many refrigerators.
Yeah.
So at some point, this is sort of a question of just simply how do we sustain the demand for the stuff we need. And then the other part, which we've realized over the last 20 years, is that we started with income inequality, but over the pandemic in particular, but the years before the pandemic, we started to realize this is also about wealth inequality and the lack of opportunity that comes with it for many households. That has driven a lot of political disenfranchisement on the left and the right. A lot of this extremism that we see on both sides is driven to a large degree by simply lack of wealth, lack of opportunity, lack of financial security. I mean, 2021 things got better, but we're still looking at about a third of American households that cannot come up with $400 in an emergency.
Yeah.
And that's just simply like the freak out factor every single day. That doesn't leave any room to start planning for the future. Which neighborhood do you want to be in? Do I want to leave my job and start a business? Do I want to get married? Do I want to send my kids to college? Can I send my kids to college?
Mm-hmm.
Which college can I send my kids to, right? Like, if you can't come up with $400, all of these other questions are basically off the table.
It's irrelevant. Yeah.
It's irrelevant.
You have no chance at all.
So we're in this extreme situation when it comes to wealth inequality and the lack of opportunity for a huge chunk of the population. I mean, we're talking like the bottom third essentially has, in terms of income or wealth, has no real opportunity. And then there's another chunk, which people you think are middle class from their jobs. This is particularly true for African Americans, Latinos, who have often decent jobs, but don't have much wealth to fall back on. They're not homeowners. They don't have much in terms of emergency savings. So they're constantly struggling and worrying about, how do I pay my bills? They're sort of captive by their jobs. That doesn't leave much room for long-term planning and for investing in your own future and that of your children. In terms of what we can do, Yeah, I mean, making Jeff Bezos a lot less wealthy, which we have done in the last few months because his wealth has dropped by 37%, doesn't make anybody else happier.
No.
Probably
all
if we had
paper
taken
money.
37% of his wealth and put it into schools, we probably would have been better off. But that's a different
Well,
question.
that gets into the other issue of, Bezos and Musk and all the rest of them are filthy rich. But it's all tied up in stocks, and the market is extremely fickle. And,
Right.
And if you grab it at the right time, it's worth something, but who are you going to sell it to? And, this is one of the concerns that I have. They talk about a policy of commandeering wealth by some means. Biden's got a plan he's kicking around of the unrealized gains, tax them. Of course, my question is, when the market goes down, does the government give you money back for?
It does. You can write it off.
Yeah. Well,
Well, if you realize it.
yeah. Well, but then again,
You're
part
right,
of the
right.
game is.
Well, I mean, presumably the tax code would be somewhat symmetric in that regard.
But the whole idea is, if you confiscate this stuff, who's going to buy half of Amazon if you take it away from Bezos?
Well, I mean, there's a huge debate, and I think we've talked about this before, like who buys the stocks. I mean, it's not just simply the question of tax policy at this point. We're in an aging society where a lot of people want to sell and need to sell because they tied up their retirement income in the stock market. There are growing populations who want to invest, not necessarily in the United States, but overseas. So that always gets us into the foreign policy issues. But I think in the end, you can sell the stuff. The question is, do we stop policies that favor wealth building at the very top end of the income scale, where people don't need additional wealth? They don't need it as an incentive. It's not like Jeff Bezos lost 37% of his stock value in the last quarter, and all of a sudden he's like, well, let me shut down all the Amazon warehouses. The incentive argument should work in both directions, and it doesn't. So,
Well, it gets to a point where he's got so much money that another few million doesn't.
it doesn't matter.
It's lost in the shuffle.
He has built this enterprise for many different reasons. May it be power, may that be just building something and a legacy. To some degree, yes, wealth. But what it also means is, and I'm coming back to Amazon and all the other tech companies these days, we're rewarding wealth and we're protecting their wealth, and we're building wealth and allowing them to build on that wealth, for instance, through property rights and copyrights. And sort of that means extracting extra money from consumers. The other way we're giving tech companies essentially wealth is, and we do this collectively as consumers, we're giving them all our data, and we're not charging the companies anything for that. So there is a number of policy issues here where, as a society, and we're not the only one, where we heavily reward wealth at the top. But because we're dedicating government resources to it, not enforcing things or not taxing things that we should be taxing. Textbook example, you raised unrealized capital gains. Anybody who teaches public finance, and I do, will teach you something that says, yes, we should be taxing that. That is income. Now, that also means the losses should be written off, but that's a different issue. The fact that we don't means we're foregoing tens of billions of dollars in tax revenue that the government should be getting. And that means resources are not available to invest in the things that we should, such as I started talking about education. But the other part is, think about the greater Boston area. We should be investing a lot of money in a workable, barely functional public transit system. A public transit system.
Oh, yeah.
Our transit system is a joke.
Yeah.
And everybody jokes about it. And anybody who needs to go into Boston from Beverly knows how bad it is and how much it costs us in terms of time hanging around stations because trains are delayed or canceled, right? Or derailed, as it happened a few weeks ago in Beverly. So that kind of those investments. Affordable housing. Beverly is doing a lot in terms of building new housing, but that is not targeting necessarily the populations who
Yeah,
are struggling
that's-
to finding housing.
That's one of my concerns about the town is that, yeah, we're building a lot of condos to take in the people that can't afford to live in Boston, but they can afford to live here. And the people that work here can't afford to live here. And we've had Andrew Defense on the show a couple of times, and he talks about affordable housing according to the codes. It says 80% of the median income routine, and housing that is affordable, that people can actually pay for and live in. So there's that disparity that, again, and that's a public policy issue of where do you set this limit on what is affordable?
Well, I mean,
And what do you do about it?
I'm not a housing expert, so I
No.
don't know the answer. But I know that it's an answer the question we need to answer sooner rather than later. I remember giving a talk many, many years ago in Sarasota, Florida, and the person who was driving me around had started a number of assisted living facilities and nursing facilities. And we were driving around Sarasota. This was the early 2000s, so before the housing market crash. And he was saying, like, I asked him, I said, like, where's the staff coming from? And they couldn't afford to live in Sarasota. They were living further north towards Tampa and other areas, often an hour and a half away. In the wake of the financial crisis and the pandemic, the same nursing homes, the same assisted living facilities basically had to shut down because they can't find the staff, because nobody at this point wants to drive on a public bus for an hour and a half to a job that pays in the end $8 an hour, where people have to risk their health. And Sarasota is heavily
It's a retirement
it's a
community.
retirement community
Yeah.
with a lot of older people who need those services.
Yeah.
Massachusetts is an aging state. Maine is an aging state. The Northeast in general is getting older. We have to address these issues, as you said. Like, we need the people who work in our towns to be able to live here, and because we rely on those services in general.
Yeah.
And that is sort of the wealth inequality, the microcosm at the local level that needs to play itself out. But it requires public policy, and it requires potentially public housing. The government actually stepping in. And it's not just housing. It is making sure that buses and trains and everything runs and is affordable and people can rely on it and runs between the towns where people live and work.
Yeah. Well, the emphasis right now is on this TOD, transient-oriented development. So the idea is that you build these condos around the train stations or a bus station. This is the governor's plan. And people who live there should be able to walk from their condo to the train station. Well, that's nice, but where's the grocery store? Where's the daycare center for couples that are starting a family? And this is one of my concerns, is that everything is so narrowly focused. They don't think about the whole system that has to support it.
Right.
And how do you get this into public policy that says, if you're going to build a condo next to the train station, not only can you build a condo, but you got to build the supermarket, the daycare center, all the rest of these facilities.
Well, a lot of the development issues or local issues, housing and development as is transit, is local or regional, where the federal government can step in and has the resources, is basically can establish grant programs and say, like, okay, well, if you build a livable community and you should have childcare and affordable schools and good schools, here's a number of grant programs you can apply to. And that was, for instance, when it comes to aging, one of the proposals that President Biden had. He wanted to spend $400 billion on home community-based services. A lot of that money would have gone to saying, okay, well, if you want to have an age-friendly community, you apply for it and you're going to get grants to hire more people, pay them better, or build new facilities. The stuff that we need. The same on the childcare side. A lot of the proposals in what ultimately was named Build Back Better, but ultimately died, was in that direction. Not just simply giving people more tax credits for having children, but also investing in a childcare infrastructure.
Yeah.
The federal government can provide the money, But in where the money gets spent and how it gets spent needs to be ultimately a local decision, because local decision makers know where the needs are greatest. But the federal government can lend a helping hand. And in some ways, they showed how they do it with the infrastructure bill, right? The infrastructure bill is putting about $70 billion into rural broadband, internet access, so that people in Western Massachusetts can have access to good jobs, telework, and other things that people in the metropolitan area do have access to with reliable internet. It's I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but it's an important step.
So, and again, the technology keeps changing, so as people, like you say, living in Western Massachusetts, Appalachia, pick any rural area, they're trapped in ancient technology, and they can't advance into the new world because they're not exposed to it.
Right.
And
well, they don't have they want to have access. They often have access to it. They have cell phones, but it's not. A cell phone is not a substitute for having a computer with a high-speed internet at home.
No.
But it goes back to the original question of what should we do in terms of addressing wealth inequality. Wealth inequality translates into income inequality. But from my perspective, and as I should say, like there's other perspectives out there, but for me it means making sure that those who do not systematically have the wealth to take advantage of the opportunities that exist, that we create those opportunities as much as we can. And we already talked about that means education, higher education, childcare, caregiving, infrastructure, transportation, and housing, broadband. Those are like just the things I can think of. Healthcare infrastructure, making sure that people who live in rural, in outlying areas, they don't even have to live in rural areas, that they have the same quality health care access that we do, right? I mean, we can go and basically walk across the street, and we're at one of the top hospitals, part of a top hospital system in the country. But these are the same hospitals that somebody who lives out in Western Massachusetts has to go to, because they're completely underserved in those areas. And that, like, just the healthcare system, like in here again, wealth inequality factors into it. If you get sick and you're out in Western Massachusetts and now you have to take 2 days off to come into Boston, maybe even rent a hotel room for your family to be with you, you're talking possibly $1,000 that you have to, like,
you haven't
lost
even got it
earnings,
fixed yet.
and you haven't been even to the doctor yet. Never mind the copay. This is, as I said, almost a third of Americans don't have $400 in an emergency. They don't have $1,000 to come into Boston to take care of their health.
And they're coming into an area that's very expensive. And believe it or not, we've had a half hour of fun.
Yes.
So I think we would like to continue this discussion, because it's got to get down to the nitty gritty of exactly what are we going to do and how do we make it happen. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching us this evening. And we will have to do this again or continue this story. And as I mention a lot of times, at the end of the credits, my email address is there. If you've got a different opinion or a similar opinion and you'd like to have a voice at the table, we'll make room for you. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.